I really, really appreciate this invitation to be here with you. Everyone has been so wonderful. And also the invitation to put together my somewhat chaotic thoughts about Mao and insurgency. And a problem, can you all hear me? Can you hear? Okay. A problem anybody faces in trying to talk about Mao and anything, including Mao and insurgency, is to find the real Mao. The reason being that the real Mao has been obscured into the myth of Mao. And part of this seems to have been created by Mao himself, and other parts of the myth are created by people who wanted to curry favor with Mao, or people who are trying to push a point, one of the points being, as you'll see, the value of people's war, including insurgency. Now, we do know certain things for sure, and one of them is that Mao never expected to win a war through insurgency or guerrilla warfare. He viewed it as the first stage in a tripartite path to victory, and so the first one is this mobile warfare in the searching out and destroying enemy units one at a time through using insurgents or regular troops. A second one, a stage of limited offensive, and a third and final one of an all-out general offensive. And another thing we know is that Mao seems to have been born a contrarian. He was the son of a rich peasant family in Hunan. Those who like psychological explanations say, well, you know, the national dish of Hunan has lots of red pepper in, and that's why revolutionaries come from there. But in fact, little Mao was a revolutionary among Hunanese. And he didn't like going to Confucian school, which wealthy little boys did. And Confucian school started around 4 o'clock in the morning. And the little boys sat there with their big Confucian texts and recited after the teacher. And Mao used to hide these bandit novels behind Confucius. And one of these bandit novels is called Shui Yu Zhuan, which literally means water margin, which doesn't mean a thing in English. And Pearl Buck translated it as all men are brothers. There is several alternate translation names, one of which is Outlaws of the Marsh, which I think is a much more evocative and fair description, because it is about a group of people who are, in the novel, very Robin Hood-like, and they see injustice, and they prey on wealthy merchants and corrupt officials, and then they flee back into the swamps in areas where the authorities can't find them. And this is very plausible in traditional China because they had no doctrine of hot pursuit, and every magistrate was held responsible for what happened in his district. So if the magistrate's troops were chasing you and you went over the border to another magistrate's bailiwick, they just went home. So that was one element. And as in all cases, these doughty guerrillas seem to have behaved more like mafia than Robin Hood in a lot of cases. And maybe if I knew more like Robin Hood, I would be able to tell you Robin Hood was mafia-like as well. But in any case, they weren't quite as altruistic and good to the peasants as I think little Mao absorbed. In any case, he does get the idea for his base areas from them. Now, the Mao, a rebel against the warlord governments of the time. China was in a very difficult position. In fact, most Chinese of the time probably didn't even think of themselves as Chinese first. I noticed that General Buckledge last night talked about loyalties to tribes and areas and so on. A Chinese in this period is liable to feel loyalty to village, to clan, to various other things before he feels loyalty to a larger entity named China. And you of course know that Marx really did not expect a revolution to take place through armies. It was going to be the spontaneous revolt of the proletariat, and this fit in nicely with traditional Chinese thinking, which had a very low opinion, because of Confucius, of the military. There was a traditional saying that you do not use, just as you do not use good iron to make a nail, you do not use good men for the army. They didn't have a navy, so that it was just the army. All right, or they didn't really have a navy. Now, so the Mao has to take directions at this early point in his career. He is not the leader of the party, and he gets directions from the Communist International in Moscow. And Stalin's idea is that there should be an alliance between the Kuomintang, then led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the CCP, led by a bunch of other people whose name you don't need to know. And there should be a series of putsches, little armed uprisings. I find, incidentally, that none of my students now know what a putsch is, but lots of other vocabulary I'll use that's antiquated, they tell me. But anyway, so these little putsches fail, and Mao actually led one of them. And after their failure, the communist insurgency in urban areas where Marx said it was supposed to take place is wiped out. Chiang Kai-shek is not too interested in winning hearts and minds here. There's no Accords program. The attitude is, if you suspect they may be a communist, kill them anyway. It is better to kill an innocent person than to let a guilty one go free. So there are very few communists left, and they flee to an area called Jingdangshan, which is on the border of 2 provinces and 4 counties. In other words, just really like the Shuihuchuan that Mao read as a child. And it is here that Mao comes up with his idea that he is going to have to rely on the peasants, no matter what Marx and the Comintern say. Mao does not have a lot of support from the rest of the Chinese Communist Party on this, and since Chiang Kai-shek captured the Yan'an archive in 1944, I believe, we actually know what they were saying to each other at this point, and there's a lot of testy exchanges between Mao, who is touting arming the peasants, and the Chinese Communist leadership at the time pushing Marx's line. Now, Mao is not saying, by the way, that this is going to have to be peasants who are insurgents or guerrillas. He wants to train the peasants as regular army troops. He has nothing against guerrilla warfare. He just says it's not going to win all by himself. And they do set about training an army. Mao makes peace with a former member of a warlord army and a reformed opium addict named Zhu De, and the peasants were actually, who didn't know, actually thought Zhu and De were the same person. So they would talk about Zhu Mao, and Zhu Mao set about training an army. Mao never had any military instruction. He certainly learned a bit on the job, but the guiding genius of the formation of what was then called the Red Army came from Zhu De and Lin Biao and a couple of other people whose names you may not know, who had formal military training. Okay, now, as this base area that they flee to prospers, it naturally attracts Chiang Kai-shek's attention. And you read about Mao's military genius. He encircles cities from countrysides. Chiang Kai-shek figured that one out too. And with the help of his German military advisors, he builds blockhouses in increasingly tightening circles around the base area. And the communists have to break out and go on their famous Long March in the mid-1930s, during which Mao finally becomes head of the Chinese Communist Party, a position he didn't relinquish except by death in 1976. Okay, so they get to Yan'an in the end, and they establish a new base area, and Chiang Kai-shek flies to not the base area, but the area around it, tries to convince the local warlord to help him wipe out the Chinese communists, and the local warlord, this gets complicated, there are a lot of them, makes common cause with the communists to kidnap Chiang Kai-shek, and the price of his release is he has to form an alliance with the Communist Party and fight the Japanese. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was always very explicit, and honestly, I feel Chiang Kai-shek has gotten a very bad rap from history, and he was a much smarter man than the American sources of the time portray him. Anybody interested in this, there's a wonderful biography of him by a man named J. Taylor, Taylor, which is definitely worth reading. But in any case, Chiang Kai-shek says, and I agree, that the communists are, the Japanese are disease of the skin, external enemy, and the communists are disease of the heart. So if you want to save China, you've got to wipe out the communists. And as I say, John was a very smart man, and he could see the handwriting on the wall, and he was pretty sure, correctly as it turns out, that eventually the United States would have to fight Japan, and therefore he wouldn't have to. All right, so in this situation, neither the communists nor the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek are particularly interested in fighting the Japanese. And they are far more interested in fighting each other. And I'm sorry I don't have time to go into this. I'm happy that I don't have to share the podium here, but I don't want to put you all to sleep in the process. But in any case, what happens is they do a pretty good job of training a military. They do find insurgency useful, and they are the two major engagements, and there are only two, that the communists fight the Japanese in are the Battle of Pingxing-Guan in 1937 and the 100 Regiments campaign from approximately July to December 1940. So only those two. The first one, the Battle of Pingxing-Guan, is considered a minor success because, if you look at the Japanese records of this, and we have those too, the Japanese assessed that they suffered from a series of two easy victories. So when they go through Pingxing-Guan, Guan is a pass through mountains of Guan. They fail to post scouts on the heights, and they fail to secure the entrance and the exit. And so the communists got them. As I say, it was a minor victory, but it was a victory. The 100 Regiments campaign was a disaster for the communists. The Japanese were perfectly happy to, put up with the communists unless they got pesty. And if they got pesty, the Japanese had an answer for it. And this fits Jeffrey Record's third case very nicely, that it's harder to win, and it's harder for an insurgency or anything else to win over a determined dictatorship. And I don't know if dictatorship is the right word, authoritarian government might be better here. But, you know, the communists were determined to portray their army as the people's army. And so they used Mencius. Mao didn't invent it. Mencius is a disciple of Confucius. Mencius's statement that the army are the fish and the people are the water. And you cannot have the fish can't be effective without being supported by the water. And so when they get too unpleasant with the Japanese have an answer, drain the pond. And they also respond with the so-called 3-all, kill all, burn all, destroy all. And so that was a failure. And what used to happen is Mao said that the more land Japan took, the better, because the Japanese would defeat the KMT troops, not all the time, but a lot of the time, and that would leave a vacuum because Japan had a much smaller population. It was a little bit in the position of the British there, long supply lines, etc. And so Maoist forces would then move into the vacuum areas where the Japanese had chased the Kuomintang out and expand their base areas. All right, now, what did Mao say about guerrilla warfare? Oh, by the way, both Ping Shing Guan and the 100 Regiments campaign are carried out on regular forces, not guerrillas. Okay, now, Mao has established guerrilla warfare subordinate to the regular army, and he says, and here I'm quoting, "When it is not advantageous for our main land army to meet the enemy in large-scale engagements, and we therefore send out commando units or guerrilla units which employ the tactics of avoiding strength and striking at weakness, of flitting about, and of having no fixed position, and of subduing the enemy according to circumstances, and when we do not oppose the enemy according to the ordinary rules of tactics, this is called employing guerrilla tactics." And he was speaking to an audience of very marginally educated or not educated people. So he is trying to buck up their courage here, and he's saying, so you don't have weapons? Yes, you do. Your kitchen knife is a weapon. I don't know if any of you have lived in a Chinese society, but almost every Chinese home will have what I would call a cleaver, and they call a chopper. It's a big knife used for hacking carcasses. It's a weapon. And he said if you don't have those, you can use a stool. Everything is potentially a weapon. And he goes on, and then he talks about tactics, and this interested me. He says, do not fight unless there's 100% guarantee of victory. And I'm trying to imagine a conversation between Lincoln and McClellan on that one. That's obviously seemed to be more the direction McClellan was leaning in. But so, no, you're not going to fight until you have, I mean, he's obviously not recommending daring do here, despite what people said later. And he talks about the size of units. He talks about political work. And this is something that's very interesting because it gets airbrushed out of the Maoist canon afterwards. Mao has quite a bit to say about sagging morale and desertions and things like that. And he talks about setting up certain people as, I don't know, security people. You have to listen to, quote, camp idlers is what Mao calls them, layabouts. You have to listen and you got to report them. We don't want any desertions and people changing their minds. And he is aware of, at some level, that these people he's dealing with are not peasantry mobilized because they hate the Japanese and they hate the KMT. The population are survivors. They basically, most of them have very little interest in who rules them. They just want to stay alive, and they hope not too much of their goods are collected as taxes. So he does talk about keeping political tabs on people and about morale, and he has a lot to say about surprise attacks. You should keep absolute silence, but when you do attack, scream and yell and get the peasants to bang guns because you're putting the fear of, I don't know, Confucius into them or something like that. Okay. Espionage, he talks about that as well. Now, how does theory work out in practice? And here, Maoist theory, again, you're going to try to get back to basics here. As I mentioned, both the communists and the KMT considered each other the major enemy and not the Japanese. There was actually an American named John Melby in Chongqing, the wartime capital of China, inland, when the news of Pearl Harbor reached them. And he said both the communists and the KMT rejoiced. It was as if it was a holiday, because now they knew the Americans would come in and beat the Japanese and they could kill each other full time. Okay, so now, since then, the Americans did beat the Japanese, as a matter of fact, and since then, the communist historians have reworked the whole history of this to show how wonderful the guerrillas were and how the Chinese communists beat the Japanese and then later beat the Kuomintang. And the role of guerrilla war is just hyped endlessly. I don't know if any of you have seen that 3-part series of what's it called? China in Revolution. It's a 3 DVD set, and it's, look, if Aaron can recommend things for you to watch, I can too. And the 3 DVD set, I show it to my students, and it goes from the waning days of the Qing dynasty up to Deng Xiaoping and his triumph, and then after Tiananmen. And there is a priceless scene in there, one of several, in which, you can tell this is a many times told over war story by an elderly peasant with no teeth. And he's sitting there in a stool, and he's saying, those Japanese devils, they came in, and I said to my friend Wang, you get that one, and I'll get the officer. And we got all of them. This is John Wayne Chinese style. And he said, at the end, those Japanese sent a wagon for our grain, but all they did when they withdrew is there was just bodies on that cart. And I thought, no, this is not the Imperial Japanese military, which was extremely adept at draining that pond. And furthermore, when the Japanese practiced their own version of protected villages, something you've read Andrew Krapinovich's work about we should have protected villages in Vietnam. The Japanese protected villages too. Good villages got privileges, and bad villages had their grain confiscated and everybody killed. So the old man's story is wonderful, and I'm glad he lived to tell it, but I doubt it was true. So the guerrillas were really, insurgency were like mosquito bites to the Japanese. They didn't do anything about it unless it got really annoying, in which case they weren't going to try to win these people over with, I don't know, with the Japanese equivalent of candy bars and things like that. Okay, now, going a little further, the war just kind of dies down in China after Pearl Harbor. Actually, the Japanese, after the European countries had declared war on Nazi Germany, after Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Japanese see their opportunity. They've got what they want in China. They've got the coastal areas, and they send their troops south to get Malayan rubber and Southeast Asian oil and things like that. So they're not too interested in fighting in China anymore. And of course, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans are fighting the Japanese. So the war just kind of dies down. And insurgency really doesn't have a big part. I checked the Pacific War Encyclopedia, and it says only 30% of communist manpower was assigned to insurgent operations. The other 70% is engaged in building up communist base areas. So that is something to remember. And now, as I mentioned, or I hinted before, none of this is evident in post-1949 China, which rigidified Mao's tactics. People's War was the reason that the communists, quote unquote, defeated the Japanese, and People's War is the way that the communists defeated the Kuomintang. And I would argue that the Americans defeated the Japanese, and that it was basically the inflation that defeated, the post-World War II inflation that defeated the KMT, but that the major battles that decided whether Mao Zedong, as he did, rode into Beijing on October 1st in a captured American Jeep, those were battles of conventional armies. Now, what does this have to say about the present day? A couple of things struck me. When Captain Lee invited me to this, I thought, oh, South Carolina, swamp fox, Mao fleeing into swamps. And I read several books, actually, on Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, and I also read Dr. Edgar's wonderful book, and it struck me that Sumter and Marion, had they cared to write down what they did, could have written everything in Mao's basic tactics. So well did they practice them. And I have a couple of quotes here from Dr. Edgar's book. Here's one. Sumter and his officers had been preparing their men to fight a new kind of warfare. Partisan or guerrilla warfare would require strength, endurance, and guile. They ran, they swam, they wrestled. They engaged in individual contests of strength and skill. Perfect. Another one. The British kept to main roads, so they were easy to attack. Perfect. Partisan leaders were elected. Since none held a recognized rank, they went to the men for approval of plans. Again, something Mao recommends. Now, every so often at the University of Miami, I'm visited by the FBI. Not the suspect as far as I know, but they come to talk to me about China, which is always fun because they're bright people with very interesting life experiences. And I was talking to one of them about this conference, and he said, he's a former special forces guy, very bright, has been in Kosovo in one capacity or another, and in Afghanistan in another capacity or another. And he said, I've got this wonderful book you have to read. And it is a Marine Corps published book. And I read it, and it is just full of this stuff about the Eastern way of war. And we don't understand Easterners. We've got to understand Easterners. And there's all these quotes from Mao and from Sun Tzu. And I'm looking at it, and I think, this is ridiculous. How much more time?
25 minutes.
Oh, wonderful. Lots to say. Anyway, there have been, Phantom Soldier is the title of the book, The Enemy's Answer to U.S. Firepowers. And it poses this dichotomy that Grofenovich does, and I think Harry Summers does as well, between high firepower, conventional American preference for war versus some kind of sneaky Eastern Sun Tzu Mao derived sort of thing, and you can win wars through just decoys and deceptions without ever thinking that Westerners have done it as well, such as Sumter and Francis Marion. And interestingly, at the very same time in China, what was going on, meaning the mid-1980s, the military began holding salons where officers would get together and discuss what they did right and what they did wrong in various wars. And some of these salons came up, or they actually published things. And in China, this is a period of considerable laxity, ideologically speaking. And also, if you don't want to publish something in China's National Defense University Press in Beijing, you can often get something published in local presses out in the provinces, and where they don't have such tight control as they do in Beijing and Shanghai. And they would later put out books that say, Lin Biao, who is anathema in China because it's alleged he tried to kill Mao, he was a pretty good commander, and so was Chiang Kaishek, whereas Mao Zedong is guilty of a lot of very bad military tactics that got a lot of people killed. And we actually have some of these titles that got infiltrated out through Hong Kong. Now, after Tiananmen, these salons are closed down and a much more rigid orthodoxy is put on, and the myth of so-called People's War is revalidated. And I would say that the Chinese are actually making themselves a lot of trouble here if they truly believe what their own writings, and I'm now not talking about the writings they put out for Westerners to read. I'm talking about their own military journals. If you can read Chinese and you have $1,200 a year, you can subscribe to something called CKNI, and it's Comprehensive Knowledge something, and you can get access to all these Chinese military journals and, you know, really read what they appear to be saying to each other. And so, assuming what they say to each other in these journals that are very hard for you to read if you don't read Chinese and they're not willing to shell out all this money every year, they are validating the myth of People's War to each other. And I had occasion to read a lot of these because I did a study of what the Chinese military has learned from the American military's performance in Kosovo. And basically, they learn all the wrong things. And it's really interesting to compare, if you look at the congressional hearings that were conducted in the United States afterwards, and read what the Chinese are saying about this. And the Chinese are saying this validates People's War because, look, the morale, when we the NATO people, bombed Kosovo, this civilian morale supported Milosevic. Well, if you look back at what happened, civilian morale supported Milosevic for about the first 12 days. And after that, people started saying, you know, we don't really like getting bombed like this. And what eventually made Milosevic capitulate was the real fear that he was going to be overthrown by his own people if he didn't stop bombing. And another thing the Chinese point to is, well, look, the Americans are never going to bomb us if People's War will triumph. Look what happened. The Americans didn't bomb that bridge when the civilians got out there and held hands over the bridge. Now, some of you may have been in Kosovo, I'm sure you were, and ask yourself, is it likely that in any future conflict, the United States would agree to the same, how do I put this diplomatically, unusual rules of engagement that it agreed to in Kosovo. Remember, we agreed, the Dutch noticed that there was a Rembrandt in the presidential palace, so we couldn't bomb the presidential palace. Remember that? And there were a few other oddities as well. Okay, so if the Chinese are counting on any future war with the Americans to do this, they may be misleading themselves. And there are a couple of other examples in the paper where, because they have mythologized what happened in Yan'an, they are saying, look, we should never have abandoned tried and true tactics. We should have done what Mao advocated. It was a myth. They didn't do that. And Mao didn't advocate that. You see what I mean? They are misleading themselves. So another thing is they never put themselves in a position of that they are likely to be in dealing with an insurgency. They are always talking about the problems the U.S. ran into in terms of insurgencies. And meanwhile, they are telling us that they plan to fight a local war on China's periphery. Now, if they are fighting a local war on Chinese periphery, who are they liable to be fighting? Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Taiwanese. Who are the insurgents in that case? Not the Chinese. See what I mean? And so as a final myth I would like to poo-poo, it's the Eastern way of war. And I think I really kind of touched on this because of the amazing similarities between Sumter and Francis Marion and Mao in terms of tactics. I have a few more examples of that. The American Indians, as you all know, didn't have horses, and as soon as they see the Spanish conquistadores riding horses, they think, oh, we know what to do with those. And they quickly incorporate them into their warfare and into their daily lives. Horses are useful. Another myth, the Mongols. The Mongols are known because they're mounted warriors, they can sleep in the saddle, but they're considered to not know how to deal with other things. Wrong. As soon as the Mongols arrived in fortified cities in the Western world, they got off their horses and they immediately adopted the catapult. There were no quarrel about, is this catapult part of Mongol culture? No. They adopt the catapult and they quickly devise the clever idea of finding someone who died of the Black Plague and then lobbing the body over the city wall. And they adopt battering rams and things like that. So the point there is any creative mind that wants to get a military advantage is going to look for what are the tactics our enemy uses against us that are liable to work, and how can we use those against them. And this, I guess, Francis Marion learned what he learned from the American Indians. Is that fair? The American Indians, in turn, learn things from the Americans. They don't say, those fire sticks are not part of our Arapaho culture, we can't use them. And they adopt them very quickly. So I would argue that there is no great advantage to insurgents, that it was a myth that it enabled the Chinese communists to triumph either over the Japanese or the Kuomintang, and that furthermore, there is no Eastern way of war. Thank you very much for your attention.
And generally, I agree with Jun's argument that much of Mao's talks about guerrilla warfare and so on, insurgency, these are mostly commonsensical. And you can see that in many cases, many different parts of the world. Even in China, for instance, there are some discussions about something very similar, for instance, between the kingdom of Chu and the kingdom of Wu 2,500 years ago, even at the time, about the time of Confucius. And in Chinese mythology, actually, you can also trace this back to the Yellow Emperor, and supposedly he had a official with the name Feng Ho. Actually, Feng Ho also talked about something very similar to what Mao said later on. And but of course, that's mythology. We really don't know whether the Yellow Emperor really exists or not. And but anyway, this certainly goes back to history, and Mao didn't also learn a lot from the ancient novels, as Jun mentioned. And I also just want to add a footnote to what Jun said. It is certainly it's kind of mythical, and it's also kind of personality cult, a bit by Mao himself, and also many of the propaganda machine in the Chinese Communist Party. And but at the same time, actually, a lot of things that Mao said, not only with regard to guerrilla warfare, but with regard to many other things, are not really solely done by Mao himself. And just for instance, in the case of guerrilla warfare, and Jun mentioned his work entitled Basic Tactics, which was seen as a kind of a Bible for many people in other countries, as a kind of really a kind of guidelines for conducting guerrilla warfare and so on. But actually, among many Chinese scholars today, you can see that there are all kinds of controversy with regard to this book. And even whether this book was written by Mao, actually, whether this cast in doubt, and we really don't know. And the controversy arises from the fact that when the book was first published in 1938, there were two versions. One version was published in Yan'an, that's the communist base area after the Long March, and another one was published by a publisher in Hankou, that's in Wuhan today. And the two versions are different. And in the first version, there's no mention of the author, so you don't know who the author was. But in the second one, they mentioned that this is the lecture by Mao and so on. So a lot of scholars actually, for those people who are familiar with Mao's works, and they look what he said and also compare to what he said in other articles and works and so on, there's some kind of inconsistency there. And also even the writing style seems to be different in some way. And we just don't know exactly whether that's Mao's works or not. But my own take on this thing is that that's probably not Mao probably was not the sole author of the book, but that's probably he's probably part of that. I mean, he's co-authored this with many of his colleagues, and they through their own personal experiences in the battleground and so on. So they try to come up with some kind of textbook and some kind of guidelines of instruction manual, that kind of thing, so that they teach that to the soldiers and other cadres in the Communist Party at the time. And so actually a lot of this kind of stuff, I mean, in so-called Mao's work, and it's sometimes you really don't know exactly whether that's his work or not. And also to be somewhat to be fair to particularly to his work on guerrilla warfare and the basic tactics, along with some other works, when he also published a very well-known article back in 1938 as well, and it's entitled "Basic Tactics" on the basic tactics of the guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, with the subtitle "Surprise Attack." And those are not really theoretical. So if you want to judge that on the basis of theory or something or logic, it's just probably unfair, because that's not really. I mean, it's just a kind of a guidelines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, so you talk about what kind of things that we should be careful about and so on. And so that's just basically that's what he has done. And but I think at least even though I'm really not a fan of Mao at all, I mean, he's really kind of a contradictory person with all kinds of contradictions. And but I think that at least his views on guerrilla warfare and some other views on warfare in general, and it shows that he's kind of flexible and person. I mean, when he's in the weak position, but also quite interesting to see that when he's in power, he's in the strong position, that he becomes so intransigent, and that's what happened during the Guerrilla Forward. And almost all his colleagues oppose him for launching these kind of crazy ideas, but he insists that it's the right thing for China to do. And the end result was that about 30 million people starved to death. And after the Guerrilla War. Actually, there's a recent study done by a professor at the Hong Kong University showing that the actual figure is probably higher than that. It's probably 45 million people starved to death. That's one of the most serious famine in human history. And man-made, basically, even though the Chinese Communist Party always claims that that's a natural disaster or something, but that actually does not. But anyway, I think at least in some way, he popularized the idea of making, try to do kind of this, to systematically talk about this, and also by not only by him, but his propaganda machine and so on. And so at least I think it's still quite useful for us, I think, to at least to learn something in that repertoire of all kinds of possible methods that may be employed, even though you can find this in many other stories as well, as just June just mentioned. And we have.
I'm not really sure. I mean, do you think Mao was the first person to come up with this? Because it seems to me that virtually every war I've ever looked at, and of course I know the Chinese war is better than any other, but virtually every war I've ever looked at, there's been a propaganda function operating. You need to be with us because the alternative is much worse, and I certainly see this in the American Revolutionary War, where people have to be persuaded and often are dissuaded, with the example of Peggy Shippen dissuading her husband Benedict Arnold, and certainly that happened in the Civil War. So I'm not sure I have learned anything from Mao, and I think Mao's success is really that the Kuomintang goofed in terms of that inflation, and that isn't even really their fault, because the Kuomintang was an urban-based group, and the CCP was in the countryside, and so it was further hurt by inflation. So, you know, Mao deserves a lot of credit because a successful revolution is its own validation, I suppose. But in a sense, it was a series of accidents that ended up with the communists winning. And certainly the other side committed a lot of mistakes as well. So I don't know what to tell you. Mao was a consummate PR guy, and maybe that's what we ought to give him credit for. But I don't think his strategy and tactics had much to do with it.
To clarify, I'm not saying he invented anything. I'm saying he was systematic in his exploitation of those things, such as propaganda, which he created a structure for, which in the West we really didn't understand very well. Mm-hmm. It took us until things like the OSS to understand this systematic need to exploit non-kinetic aspects, not just through great generalship. So that's the comment I would make.
Okay, it seems to me he was best systematic about that after 1949. Because he didn't really have the apparatus to do it beforehand. The different base areas, and there were three major ones, had relatively little communication with each other and developed a lot of different patterns. This is, I don't know if you've ever read William Whitson's book on the field armies, but that they had very different behavior patterns from each other, which shows up in rivalries between them later on. So, yeah, Mao tried hard. The evening talks at Yan'an, where he tries to get everybody on board with his ideology, and he says literature and art, everything has a political function, and what was the other line? I'm sorry, it'll come to me in a second. But, oh yeah, the Junk Fund campaign. Everybody has to be on board ideologically. So he certainly had the right idea, but if you say he systematically, I mean, he thought it up systematically, but he could not apply it systematically because the communications network just wasn't available to him. And after 1949, he managed to do it a lot better. So I'm not sure Mao was ahead of the curve there, put it that way.